Yesterday, October 22nd, 2022, I was listening to some commentary on global politics, and they were talking about how nuclear war is a real possibility, and it's mainly a possibility due to basically insane people in positions of power, uh, especially those who have taken control of the federal government in the United States. And after going through the details of that, this commentator then said that what he believed the solution to that problem is direct democracy, where you can easily vote on more and more matters, in the legislature directly via your smartphone or whatever. That is not the answer. And the fundamental blunder, once again, is disregarding basic ethics. So when you're looking at an issue like possible nuclear war, basic fundamental ethics seems like it could seem to someone almost as like irrelevant. Like, well, that's all fine and good, that's nice, kind of like academic, philosophy you got there, or some ethics, that works in a university classroom. But here in the real world, it's different, and it's not so relevant. But that's incorrect. Actually, the only reason why we're in a position where nuclear war is a possibility is because most people don't understand basic ethics, and they don't promote them. They don't stand by them. And that's what allows these institutions to grow and then become potentially deadly for all of humanity. Analogous to cancer, right? They just let it grow and grow and grow until the point where it kills the organism, right? The only reason nuclear weapons exist, think about, where did nuclear weapons come from? States, right? That's that's how they were made. And the reason why states were able to make them is because they had immense resources, wealth, and manpower, right? And where did they get all that wealth and manpower from? Taxation, right? From the bedrock of their existence, right? And what is taxation? Taxation is extortion. Taxation is coercing people to pay you money, whether they want to or not, and threatening them with violence if you don't pay up. It's just mafia tactic, number one. It's extortion. But people don't see it as such. They think it's actually a good thing. They don't think it's just extortion. They think it's, this voluntary um, consent of the governed that legitimizes taxation, right? We have the phrase "no taxation without representation." This kind of continuously or repeatedly blows my mind every time I hear people say "no taxation without representation," or even on the license plates in Washington D.C. Last I saw, they have them. They have this phrase, on the actual license plates. All the cars there say "no taxation without representation." The reason this repeatedly confounds me is because why do you think you're actually being represented? Or, even further, if you actually ask people, do you think, especially now, if you were to take a poll in the United States, like, does the federal government represent you? You're going to have like hundreds of millions of people saying no, right? Okay. So if taxation is only legitimate if you're being represented, and most people will say outright, I'm not being represented, then where is the legitimacy? But on a deeper level, even more technical level, the idea of representation is actually false, to put it simply. The idea that some politician can actually represent like tens of thousands or hundreds of millions of people. Like that's just impossible. It's not even a possibility. So again, where is the legitimacy? Not only are people vocalizing I'm not being represented, but even if they found someone that agreed with them, on a lot of things, you're not going to find someone that can represent you perfectly, right? Because we're all individuals, right? We all have our own thoughts and beliefs, and certainly we can have agreement on certain major issues, but the idea of representation in and of itself is, to put it mildly, highly questionable. Likewise, with consent of the governed, there is no actual consent. Just like there is no actual representation, there is no actual consent being given. For there to be real consent, a real choice, in other words, you would have to be able to opt out without facing, severe negative consequences. Even if they said, oh, sure, you can, check this box here to say that you renounce your citizenship and want to be, sovereign. But once you do that, we're going to, commit all this aggression against you. That's not a real choice, right? It's again just the same dynamic, really, as extortion, where, oh, sure, you have a choice. You can choose to not pay us, but if you don't, then we're going to make your life worse, right? The idea of implicit consent has just been already debunked by excellent commentary, particularly by Michael Huemer, I'm familiar with, where he just breaks down step by step, or all the supposed versions of consent, like just being born somewhere somehow, being born somewhere on the planet, like, oh, you've just given your consent, or if you use any of the services that are paid for by the extortion that you're being coerced to pay, well, then that also is implicit consent. That's false. It's just clearly not um, ethically sound. It's not logically sound. It's just bullshit. Or to say that you can vote. Well, what if there's no candidate that you want to vote for? So again, there's no real choice. Or what if you want to vote to not be a part of the system at all? That's not a choice. So again, consent is about choice. And so if you don't have a real choice to disassociate, right? There's the uh, phrase freedom of disassociation, right? Well, if you're being forced to fund things you disagree with, that's unethical, and that's denying your freedom of disassociation, right? It's denying your freedom to say, no thanks, I don't want to be in a relationship with you, right? And that's what politics is, especially on the, communist side, made much more clear. These are abusive control freaks that want to force you into a relationship with them. And if you try to end the relationship or say, hey, I don't like this relationship, they just immediately attack you and slander you and call you all kinds of bad names, right? You're crazy, you're an extremist, etc. It's very similar. It's basically the same thing on the personal level, where you have, an abusive relationship where someone is guilt tripped and manipulated into staying in the relationship. And a main way that is accomplished too is by making the person being abused dependent on the abuser, right? And that's definitely a big part of what we see in politics, right? If you want to get a job, or um, if you want to travel in a vehicle, right, you need government permission, government forms, right? Otherwise, you're a criminal, right? So you're coerced into a position of dependency. And on the economic level, as I've talked about many times before, that's accomplished by undermining your economic security and stability by putting you in a position where you have to serve wealth, serve mammon, by having to pay just to live on the planet, right? Property tax, paying for water, paying for land. The system that demands money from you on a regular basis, and so you then have to serve money. You have to then earn this money, acquire this money in order to keep them away, right? To keep them from committing further aggression against you. So, in the Declaration of Independence, there's the statement that uh, to secure our rights, our natural rights, governments are formed, right? And this is actually the fundamental blunder. And this is what gets back to what I was saying earlier about basic ethics, lack of understanding of basic ethics actually being the root problem of all this, including, potential nuclear war, along with all of the other destructive, conventional war they call it, or all the other um, destructive and deadly activities that governments have carried out. Genocide, drone strikes that kill like 90% of the people. 90% of the people that are killed aren't even who they were targeting, and who's to say that who they were targeting even deserved to deserve that, right? So it's just atrocity after atrocity, right? Depleted uranium, I could just go on and on. You should be familiar with like the history of Stalin, Lenin, Pol Pot, Mao, right? What's currently going on in North Korea, China, just horrible, destructive, oppressive, hellish conditions brought on by states over and over, which are clear violations of our natural rights. But wait, government is supposed to secure our rights. So why isn't that actually what we see going on, right? In Canada, just this past week, I believe, they banned all handguns. The crazy uh, weirdo of a, he's like a villain out of a movie, uh, of a leader, so-called leader they got there. Just gave his speech about all handguns being banned. And why? Of course, it's for safety, right? So this is the fundamental blunder again, is thinking that violation of basic ethics is actually acceptable sometimes, and that empowering an unethical institution actually somehow is going to result in an ethical outcome. So in the case of banning handguns in Canada, that's an aggressive act. You're disarming nonviolent people. If you can't see that, if you just think, well, it'll make the country safer, I'm restraining myself from using like negative words too harshly. You're unaware of political history. You're unaware of the fact that these people in power that want a monopoly on the ownership of firearms are not angelic. Like, how you do not understand that, I really don't know. I guess because you just are bombarded with propaganda on a daily basis, telling you that this is what's needed for safety, and these are the authorities that we can trust, and so yeah, let's let them have all the guns and leave us in a vulnerable, disarmed state so that they can control us further, right? Like, how you see that as a good idea, um, whatever your thinking is, it's surely irrational, and it's surely based on falsehood and a lack of morality. Back in the back in the day, it's the 18th century, Benjamin Franklin once said, no longer virtuous, no longer free. And then another quote from that century, different individual said, the people never give up their liberties, but under some delusion. And that's exactly what it is. If you think allowing people to abuse you is a good idea and will actually protect you, that's delusional. You're believing that what you want to be protected from, you believe that being subject to what you want to be protected from, I can't even put it into a sentence. It's so ridiculous. It's so nonsensical. The idea that allowing an institution to commit abuses against you is going to preserve your natural rights is a contradiction in terms. Like, it's just completely irrational. You're saying, I'm going to let them violate my natural rights so that they can protect my natural rights. That's the fundamental blunder of statism. And I was reading an article on the Declaration of Independence, and this line in particular about, governments are created to secure our rights. And I just want to read from this article. Um, this is from the website founding.com, founding as in the founding fathers. So let me just read this to you because this is really like the main belief that upholds this whole, I want to say beast system that, could potentially destroy all life on Earth or destroy good, large portions of it, like what we saw in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but, times, 100 times or 1,000 times worse. The institutions that would carry that out, the people in those institutions that have that power, that would carry that out, have been given that power because people believe that they are securing their rights. In other words, that they're keeping them safe. So this is the article. Quote, the Declaration's third self-evident truth answers the question, why do men establish government? The answer, to secure natural rights or the rights people are born with. The Declaration implies that these rights are not secure outside of government. Outside of government, people are in what the founders called the state of nature. They have natural rights, but when men live without government, those rights are jeopardized. So let me just stop there. So without government, your rights are jeopardized. And yet government is based on violation of those exact rights, right? What are natural rights? What is your natural right? That's what needs clarity, first of all. As I've explained before, the natural right of man is basically freedom or liberty. And that means you have the freedom to do whatever you want as long as you don't violate the freedom of others, as long as you don't abuse others, right? It's basically, or more, I could say even more fundamentally, it's what Jesus said is the perfect moral law, which is the greatest commandments, which is comprehensive love towards God, others, and yourself. And the opposite of that version of love, that befriending love, is abuse. So whenever you hear natural rights, you should think in your mind the right to not be abused. That's what it is. That all natural rights are just examples of not being abused in various ways. So when they say without government, those rights are jeopardized, again, it's a contradiction in terms because it's self-contradicting because government is based on extortion. Like what is a state? It's fundamentally an institution based on extortion, right? People think it's a like giant protection service, but you can have a protection service without extortion. So, those do exist. They've always existed. So, what distinguishes a state from other private practices or private services is that they are based on extortion, which is a violation of your natural right because extortion is abusive. So this is the fundamental blunder again, is thinking that by accepting abuse, you're actually being protected from abuse. So let me go on and read this further. As James Madison explained in Federalist Number 51, in the state of nature, the weaker individual is not secured against the violence of the stronger. Interesting, right? The weaker individual is not secured against the violence of the stronger. And getting back to Canada disarming the people, and most other states having done the same, that is making each individual in those regions weaker, right? And they are no longer secured against the violence of the stronger, right? Because the already strong and powerful have become even more strong and powerful, right? And that's why all these tyrants and communist crazies throughout history, the first thing they do, and this is true on even a small scale, first thing people do when they want to control others is they disarm them, right? Because they want them to be weaker and unable to secure themselves against the violence of the stronger, as James Madison said. But he was, again, lacking this fundamental ethics, not recognizing that the very thing he's advocating is carrying out what he's saying it's going to prevent. So the article goes on to say, in such a state, even the decent may be tempted to act according to their selfish passions rather than their reason and duty. Okay, so here again is a major, major blunder, a major falsehood. So they're saying in the state of nature or anarchy, where you're not being extorted and ruled over, that it's then that you'd be tempted to act according to your selfish passions. Right, rather than being given enormous wealth and power, rather than you think someone living in a free society is going to be more tempted to commit unethical acts, to be a crazy control freak, compared to someone who's given a position in government where they're basically given a get out of jail free card and they can commit all kinds of abuses and get away with it, right? They can commit extortion, but you can't. They can disarm people, but you can't, right? You think giving them this monopoly on violence isn't going to corrupt them into being unethical? Like, just on a common sense, psychological evaluation level, obviously that's not true. But then if you look at all the history, it's clearly not true. Like, so again, it's just, they just contradict themselves. Like, the statist mindset is just full of contradictions. He's saying that the the form of society that we have to prevent from existing, or that we have to change, right? The state of nature, in other words, how humans are just born on the earth. Oh, that's not good. This is dangerous. This is bad. We gotta immediately put the clamp down. We gotta control these people. We gotta institute these institutions based on extortion and a monopoly of violence that just get increasingly more oppressive, exploitative, and violent, and could possibly destroy all life on Earth through nuclear war. We need that. We need that to prevent the anarchy of the state of nature. Oh, like, this is insanity. Like, this is so stupid. I don't even, again, I'm trying to restrain myself here from using too harsh language, but it is stupid. It is just really stupid. All right. Continuing on. So the state of nature is characterized not by life, liberty, and happiness, but rather violent death, slavery, and misery. Right. Tell that to all the people that have actually, experienced violent death, slavery, and misery due to governments, right? Like, as if that's never happened, as if that's not actually the historical political norm. Because of this, and so that they can enjoy their rights and peace, people join to form governments, right? Enjoy their rights and peace, right? Yeah, that's exactly the opposite of what goes on, even in the so-called land of the free, right? Where we have these communist control freaks pushing drugs on people, you know, possibly pushing us into nuclear war, right? Disarming people, taxing them without representation, right? All these acts of violence and destruction, all these forms of tyranny, right? We're just peacefully enjoying our rights. Reminds me of what Henry David Thoreau said in his essay "Resistance to Civil Government." He said that government is best which governs not at all. But yet, people think that we have to set up these institutions. We have to. Because even though what they're doing would be unethical for us to do to one another, it somehow serves the greater good when we let them have that power and when we let them commit those abuses. Like, there's no logic there. There's no reality there. There's no truth, morality, or logic, right? Those are the three modes of decision making. And in each category, the decision to be statist is flawed. Okay, continuing with this article. When people set up a government, they must give up some of the power they had in the state of nature. For example, one gives up the right to punish wrongdoers and gives the right to government. In this sense, one surrenders some of the natural right to liberty. But in another sense, the right to liberty is unalienable, meaning that one never gives it up at all. What? Like, did that make any sense? No. Let me read that to you again, because this is like the convoluted reasoning that is actually upholding this whole insane society we live in that is just getting worse and worse. One surrenders some of the natural right to liberty, but in another sense, the right to liberty is unalienable, meaning that one never gives it up at all. So you're giving it up, but you're not giving it up. Okay, yeah, sure. Continuing. That is, no one rightfully assigns to a government absolute authority over his freedom of action, and no one rightfully gives up his ultimate right to revolt against a tyrannical government. Oh yeah, revolt after you've been disarmed. Yeah, good luck with that. One surrenders liberty conditionally. We give some of it to government on the condition that government secures our rights. So again, this idea that we give up liberty on the condition the government secures our liberty. Right? Again, this is contradicting itself. But you might think, oh, well, you just have to give up 10% of your liberty, but then that secures the 90%. Right? To be fair to the statist, that might be more close to what they're actually thinking. They might think, yeah, most of our rights are going to be maintained in a state of security, right? We're going to be living in peace, enjoying our liberties, as was stated earlier. Yeah, that's a nice theory, right? That it's just going to stay at like whatever that low percentage you think it's going to stay at. Give me one example of that actually being the reality. Give me one example of government being limited to a certain amount of abuse and they never went past that. Right? There's no example. You're delusional. Okay, next. For instance, people may not rightfully give government the right to kill or enslave them or confiscate their property, except as restitution for injuries committed, right? They put that in parentheses because in the Constitution, right, it says, slavery is not allowed unless you commit a crime, right? So unless the government calls you a criminal, slavery isn't okay. But if they call you a criminal, okay, now you can be a slave. So it's basically giving them unlimited power because all they got to do is say something is criminal, make something illegal, and now you can be a slave. But people accept some restraints on the liberty they enjoyed in the natural state for the sake of more secure liberty. For instance, they give a portion of their property for the greater protection of the right of acquisition. For example, when taxes go to pay for judges and national defense. Right, because we can't commit judgment or defense without these special angels, these special authorities who are in no way corrupted by their positions of power. It's actually us in our free state of nature that are the most corruptible. In the book Lion of Liberty, Patrick Henry and the Call to a New Nation by Harlow Giles Unger, there's some very insightful or eye-opening portions here on what life was like on this continent back then. This is on page 32, Lion of Liberty. Settlers isolated in the hamlets and woods of New England had lived free of almost all government authority for more than 150 years. They had cleared the land, felled great forests, built homes and churches, planted their fields. Goes on to say, cooperating with each other, collectively governing themselves, electing their militia commanders and church pastors, and turning to assemblies of elders to mediate occasional disputes. Self-reliant, often courageously so, they had thought and acted independently for 4 or more generations, seldom hearing, let alone responding to, utterances from the church, throne, or parliament in far-off London. Like Patrick Henry, they had lived in freedom, without government intrusion in their lives, and sought little need for it. So here we find, as can be found in many other sources, not just on history of people in this continent, but all around the world, where they were living in that state of nature or anarchy, not being ruled over, and they were actually doing well, and they were living freely. They might have had many challenges, but at least they were not slaves. Earlier in this book, Lion of Liberty, I'll read a couple more passages. Far from government constraints and urban crowding, everyday life in the Piedmont was an adventure with wild animals. It goes on. For backcountry farmers and frontiersmen, the business end of a musket was the best way to preserve individual liberty from government intrusion. And Patrick Henry was one of them, their man, their hero. George Washington viewed frontier life as anarchy. Henry called it liberty. Virginia patriot George Mason called Henry, quote, the first man upon this continent in abilities as well as public virtues, end quote, and the founding father most responsible for, quote, the preservation of our rights and liberties. Interesting how Patrick Henry, even though he was considered like the number one founding father to early Americans, is discarded in history, or not given much attention, right? And why is that? It's because he was for basically a free society, and he warned against the federal government growing in size more and more to the point at which it is today. You could say, prophesized exactly the situation we're in now. So it makes sense that state schools now, which are basically like communist schools, don't want you to be familiar with what Patrick Henry was about, because he was basically the opposite. His stance, his view was, the opposite of what communism is and what the United States has become. On the previous page it says, without Patrick Henry, there might never have been a revolution, independence, or United States of America. A champion of religious freedom, Henry fought to end slave importation and was the true father of the Bill of Rights. Recognized in his day as America's greatest orator and lawyer, Henry bitterly opposed big national governments, American as well as British. So again, the fundamental blunder, the distorted knowledge of good and evil, which has led to the fall of man, is thinking that abuse is sometimes okay. Extortion is sometimes okay. Disarmament to some of nonviolent people is sometimes okay. Medical coercion, pushing drugs on people, sometimes okay, right? If these so-called authorities carry it out, right? And so they just keep running with that and keep clamping down further and further and getting more. And then the thing is, as they do so, that actually um, has a psychological effect on them where they get even more crazy by the additional power they've gained. Right? And that's why you see post disarming the people, they then carry out worse atrocities, right? It's because they become even more insane with power. And so this idea that giving people this unnatural power increases our safety is completely false. It's just 100% false. People keep fighting against power crazy politicians, while the good people that aren't so crazy as to actually support them or think that, these so-called social justice movements that they're indoctrinated to think are, avenues of real justice, but are really just means of giving the state more power. People that understand what real liberty and justice are and fight against these power crazy politicians are simultaneously contradicting or canceling their own activity by legitimizing these same powers, by thinking that they're necessary, right? Well, we got to give them some power to abuse, 10%, and so that we could secure the 90%. It's a necessary evil. And that's the main blunder. That's false. That's 100% incorrect. You can't make the world a better place through abuse. Abuse makes the world worse. So if you think giving people the right to abuse, which then makes them more powerful and more crazy and more abusive, is going to make the world a better place, you are incorrect. I don't know how else to put it. You're just wrong. Power does corrupt, and oftentimes we see these people that seek this power or just take the power, right? Like stealing elections does happen, coups do happen. It's not even like the supposed legitimate process in which people take power is always utilized. But even if it is, how do you know that they're not just putting on a good show during the campaign so that they can get the power that they really want, right? Which is oftentimes, again, what we see with politicians all over the world that say one thing during the campaign and then switch it up and become these crazy abusive people after they get in power. South America in particular, there's plenty of examples of that. But here in the States too, everywhere. Power does corrupt. So by forming these abuse approved positions or positions of abuse approval, right? It's like, oh, it's okay if you do abusive things. It's okay if you commit extortion and disarm people and push drugs. That's all fine for you to do. We give them these positions of unnatural power, which if they weren't already wicked and deceptive seeking that position of power, and hence strive to be in government. Like most good-natured people aren't interested in politics because they know it's a dirty business, right? They know it's about controlling people and manipulating people, and it's all about bribes and corruption and so on. This position will just make them so. Even if they do go in with good intentions, if they're not taken out by the system, right? Because the system is fundamentally incompatible with love, basically, right? If we're talking about making the world a better place, we're talking about like more loving action in the world, right? But if you may have like a man or woman that gets into politics with a loving intent, right? Like, oh, I really do want to make a change. But the blunder is thinking that an institution based on the opposite of love is going to be the means to carry out or exercise love. It doesn't work that way. You can't abuse to be loving. I know that might seem like too simplistic. That's the problem, is people think like it's not that simple, but it actually is. So it's not only immoral, but it's irrational to be a statist. So I hope you found some of this insightful and helpful, and that you'll stop supporting abuse in the name of protecting society from abuse. All right, thanks for listening. And just a final note, anticipating common objections, which again are based in irrationality, immorality, and falsehood. When I was talking about disarming nonviolent people, because of what's been highlighted in the news, mainly these shootings by typically drugged up people in gun-free zones designated by the state, you might be thinking, well, by disarming people, we're going to disarm those people, right? By disarming everybody, it'll include these people that are committing these violent acts, and so therefore there won't be any more violent acts anymore. So if that's your reasoning, I'm going to just briefly explain why that's incorrect, why that doesn't actually make sense. Number one, again, recognize the majority of these violent acts occur in gun-free zones, right? Zone areas designated by the state that disarm everybody, right? So they're kind of like mini examples of exactly what you want the whole country to be like, right? You want the whole country, coast to coast, to be a gun-free zone, right? And you think that that's going to prevent these shootings, right? Well, like over 90% of the shootings occur in those gun-free zones. So why would you think that expanding the gun-free zones would decrease the amount? If there's people armed in a place, they can defend themselves, right? And this has happened many times, although the news rarely highlights these stories, where someone maybe who is drugged up and crazy and violent starts shooting at people. If he does that in a place that isn't a gun-free zone where people are armed, he's stopped almost immediately, right? And so what could have been a drawn-out tragedy where more innocent lives are lost is turned into a lesser tragedy, right? Because people have the right to defend themselves. So that's point one on why you're wrong. Point two is, why do you think that the government never carries out mass violence? Like, what planet do you live on? Seriously. You think that giving governments all the weapons is going to prevent mass violence? Really? Like, what, again, like, are you in a separate reality from the one I live in? Because in the reality I live in, they are actually the ones that have committed the greatest acts of mass violence using weapons, right? And again, now they have nuclear weapons and could potentially, destroy all life on Earth with those weapons. And yet you'd think that if they're the only ones with the weapons, we're safer, right? So, point two on why you're completely wrong. And on the front of pushing drugs, I was actually overly kind in not pointing out that not only are they pushing drugs, but they're pushing oftentimes harmful drugs, right? Like, how many people have been injured and killed by the drugs that they've been pushing, right? Of course, state-controlled media suppresses these numbers, but they're extremely high, right? Tens of thousands, if not millions of people have been injured or killed by these drugs that they're pushing, right? And again, why do you assume that, number one, they know best, and so they can prescribe medicine for the entire planet, and it's surely going to be the right medicine for you? And number two, that maybe, how is it that you don't even conceive of the possibility that maybe some crazy control freak, tyrant, or Satanist got into a position of power who thinks that it actually, wiping out portions of the population is for the greater good, and, out of chaos, they can create their order. Like, why do you think that's an absolute impossibility? It's funny that people that are promoting liberty are called naive, when it's really the statists who are the most naive people on the planet. Oh, and actually, a third point on why you're wrong about making the entire planet a so-called gun-free zone, which really is a misnomer because it's guns only for the state, guns only for government zone, is that you think it's never happened in history that states have actually carried out acts of terrorism for their own purposes. This is called state-sponsored terrorism. And apparently you think it has never happened before, or if you think, okay, it may have happened in the past, but for some reason, again, not based on truth, logic, or morality, just your own pipe dream here, that is never going to happen again in the future, you can't conceive of the possibility that maybe some of these shootings and events that take place are actually organized from the top down by states to further their agenda, which is disarming the people, right? They want to have the outcome of gaining more power by disarming everybody. And so it's in their interest to have events take place that would then act as a so-called justification for that, right? It's a historical fact that states have been engaged in acts of terrorism for their purposes, for their own purposes. And again, it's just this fundamental blunder of thinking like that people crazed with power like don't exist somehow. Like the socialist mindset is just so disconnected from reality. It's bizarre. I mean, the only way it makes sense in a way is just recognizing that they're just only paying attention to propaganda. Like they're just getting a constant feed of propaganda, which is shaping their thinking. So they never hear thought like I'm sharing in this audio. Operation Northwoods is an example in the States of state-sponsored terrorism, like the Reichstag fire with Hitler. He set his own building on fire to make, to blame on the enemy, to then use as justification for an act of aggression, right? Like there's probably, countless examples that you could find throughout history of state-sponsored terrorism. There was an old documentary called Terror Storm by InfoWars that went into that, the history of state-sponsored terrorism. So yeah, it's just yet another reason, to add on to the fact that if people can defend themselves, that's going to help end violent acts, and that these violent people are attracted to gun-free zones. It's interesting, right? Like, so, okay, the shooters are attracted to these gun-free zones because they know nobody can defend themselves. Well, the communists want to make the whole world a gun-free zone because then they can carry out even more abusive control. Just like the shooter wants to go into that school or whatever that's a gun-free zone. That's the same, you could say, basic mentality of the communists overall, is that they want to make the whole world that way so that they can then commit more abuse. But people just look at these politicians on the TV screen and they think like, oh no, they're just looking out for our own good. Like, again, the possibility that they're insane and looking to actually, make the world more hellish is just not a possibility. That's just a crazy conspiracy theory. And, we should just keep accepting their abuse and hoping that it's all going to work out for the best, right up until, nuclear annihilation.